Well, I already did an episode describing what the series is going to be, so I guess I should do a proper episode of the series, shouldn't I? Well, let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Britton here, also known as Samoki Dude, and today I am back with the second episode of The Fate of Fantasy, where I will be talking about the genre of fantasy and the history of it, as well as the many subgenres and tropes and traditions of storytelling that are associated with the genre. This is a show I've been putting together for a while, and the second episode I am going to be doing today is going to be discussing the question of what is fantasy. Now, before I get into this, I should note that this is my opinion, which I know that probably should go without saying, but I know a lot of people are probably going to nitpick what I'm going to say here today, so just keep that in mind. It's my opinion. I also use some videos that I will be discussing, and I will link down below that you might find helpful as well, which helped me in the making of this video. So, keep that in mind as I go through this video. So, let's get into this episode. So, a lot of people ask, what is fantasy? And it's a good question, because despite the popular conception of fantasy, it's actually a very diverse and layered genre. There have been videos and conversations that have attempted to decipher this question from people like Philip Chase and A.P. Canavan. There has even been some from other people. I think Raph has even discussed this. Even I have discussed, Tutor Ramble made a video discussing it, and there have been plenty of videos from different people that have made that have discussed the question of what fantasy is. And once you go into the rabbit hole, no pun intended, you find that it goes deeper than anticipated. Now, keep in mind, I am not an academic like Dr. Philip Chase or Dr. A.P. Canavan. I'm just very passionate about the fantasy genre and about the history of the said genre because I think it's a very interesting subject and a lot of people don't usually talk about it on BookTube unless you are those guys or a Bridger from the library ladder for that matter. But that's one of the major reasons I started the show, because I wanted to inform people about fantasy and the fact that it is a genre that is very diverse and versatile in its range. I mean, I could go further into that, but it would just turn into an unhinged rant, and I imagine you guys don't want to see that. I mean, I know some of you might want to see that, but I personally don't want to give that, because that wouldn't be a very constructive video or discussion that I'm hoping to start here today. Let's move forward. I don't want to give a dry lecture about the history of fantasy and where it came from, because on the one hand, I could do a whole other episode about this subject on this show, but for one, I want these videos to be succinct, and also Philip Chase already made a really good video discussing where fantasy came from and the origins of the genre and some of the mythological influences. I'll link that down below. So you can check it out. And to keep things brief, though, fantasy is one of our oldest genres. People have been making up stories about monsters, prophecies, and gods since the beginning of time, and we haven't really changed much despite our vast advancements in technology. But once again, the question rears its head. What is fantasy? Well, I'll give the generic answer first. When most people think of fantasy, they generally think of swords, sorcery, princesses, dragons, magic. You get the idea. It is a very general idea of fantasy, I will admit, and there is a lot of traditions of storytelling and traditions of fantastic literature that those certain tropes are pulled from. But there have also been many authors who have used a lot of these tropes and storytelling tools in order to create compelling works from it. But Britain, one might ask, what about some of these other books that you've talked about on your channel, like The Vor, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and Piranesi from the same author, Black Leopard, Red Wolf, Perdido Street Station, American Gods? These books don't fall into these tropes, and yet they're still unequivocally fantasy. You would be right. That's kind of and I think that actually leads to my point that fantasy is actually a very diverse and layered genre with a lot of different tones and storytelling models that aren't just the ones that we're accustomed to. Now, I did watch a video from Tutor Ramble's discussion on why fantasy is the most important genre. It's a really good video. I really enjoy it. I really like Tutor Ramble's style. They're not academic, but they are very down to earth and they're very honest, and I do like the directions they go. I also really like the conspiracy theory that Benjamin Franklin is a time traveler. Keep that spinning around, guys. We need to get that conspiracy theory more traction. But they made the distinction that science fiction, as opposed to fantasy, is about our world, but with technological advancements, and fantasy is about different worlds that are unlike our own. And they're right, kind of, but I do think it goes deeper than that. Both science fiction and fantasy are speculative genres. They think about things that are going from improbable to impossible. And it also questions, it's where the question of what could be is being discussed throughout the genre. And as E.L. Montague once told me, science fiction is about the future, while fantasy is about the past. But I digress. So again, we're at the question. I haven't really defined it, but what is the definition of fantasy then? What is my definition of fantasy? Well, for me, fantasy is the literature of the imagination. As Rod Serling once said, fantasy is the impossible made probable. And to answer the question from Tudor Ramble's discussion on if there is something that defines the fantasy genre, I would probably say that it would be imagination, where we imagine characters and situations and ideas that are technically impossible from what we know. I mean, as far as we know, dragons don't exist, monsters don't exist, snake creatures don't exist. I mean, there are big snakes out there, but there's not snake creatures like in Conan, for instance. That probably wouldn't happen. But these are also things that are worth reaching for. And I mean, I could also go into a discussion on what the fantasy genre means to a lot of people, but I think that could be made into made it into a different video of its own. Fantasy is the literature of dreams and of what could never be. But it is also the literature of the mythic, where we take the myths and legends of old and reforge it, passing them on to the new generations so that they can be inspired and tell their own fantasy stories, as what has always been done throughout the generations. Now, that's not saying I think we should sit down by a campfire and share stories about Westeros or anything like that, but I do think that fantasy literature is kind of a modern version of that in a way, that we haven't really moved on from that kind of very primal need to imagine, the primal need to tell stories. And that's ultimately what fantasy is. And at the end of the day, fantasy is the genre where anything is possible. I do think that is the purest definition of fantasy. But that is just my opinion. I know there are a lot of other people who have differing opinions on what the fantasy genre is. There was even a video about classic fantasy that was I think it was Josh, Philip Chase, AP, and Bridger from the library later. It was an interesting video, and that's actually one I would like to make a video response to on this very show at some point, but I'm already kind of going on as it is. But what I think fantasy is, well, like I said, the literature of imagination. And that's ultimately what I think fantasy is in its purest form. I'm sure people, like I said before, will probably nitpick what I'm saying and go, well, what about this? And what about that? Like I said, this is my opinion. This is what I think. And, I mean, if you want to add your own opinions, feel free. I mean, that's really what this show is meant to do, is to spark a discussion, about the fantasy genre, and maybe discuss what our competing opinions on what fantasy as a genre is. But yeah, I'm kind of rambling on at this point. But yeah, that's kind of all I got for today, talking about the fate of fantasy. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you disagree or agree with my definition of fantasy, please let me know in the comment section. I would love to hear from you guys. As I like to do before the end of these, you can like, subscribe, do all that stuff. You can find me on Twitter. You can also find me on Goodreads and Letterboxd, where I write reviews that are probably more coherent than the one you just heard right now. You can also find me on Blue Sky and Instagram. I don't use Blue Sky very much, but I am starting to use it a lot more, so go find me on there and come follow me. I do enjoy hanging out with you guys. And like I said before, like, comment, subscribe. As my buddy John Minton likes to say, it feels good when you do it. I love hearing from you guys. I love hearing comments. And if you guys like Fate of Fantasy, let me know if you have any more ideas. If you guys have any ideas for Fate of Fantasy, let me know down below. I would love to hear from you guys, and I am totally open to ideas. I do have plenty of ideas to use for the fate of fantasy. But I would love to hear from you guys though, because I do value I do value you guys' opinion about what I should do for this show. So if you have any ideas, let me know. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of The Fate of Fantasy, and hopefully I won't get too scrutinized for my definition of what fantasy is. Like I said, I am hardly an academic or expert on the subject. I am just a fan who is very passionate about the subject. So, yeah. Anyway, until next time, this has been The Fate of Fantasy. I've been Britton, also known as Somoki Dude, and till next time, bye bye.